It's very exciting that people are here from all over. We are really glad that this is reaching folks and that it's of interest. We're going to get started with a quick poll question, just so I have a feel for where you all are in terms of your familiarity with rapid qualitative analysis. And if you see me looking up, it's because I'm looking at my second screen. That's what's got my attention up there. Okay, great. Thank you all so much. So we have a few folks that use rapid analysis, some who think they might be using it, some who maybe started using it but are no longer using it, some who know what it is but haven't used it, and actually most who don't know what it is. So that's going to be very fun for us today. Thank you so much for answering that poll. We'll have one later in our session. So this is a 2-hour session. We'll see how we're doing in terms of needing a break in about an hour. I can't guarantee that I'll take one if we're on a roll, but we might take a brief one. We'll see how it goes. And I know some folks have to end early. Okay, so let's get started. And I just want to share with you the objectives for our session today. So it's really important in thinking about using rapid analysis to first think about methods. What I'll share with you really throughout the session is that the approach that I'm going to describe to you is not well suited for every, or at least I don't think it is, well suited for every type of qualitative project. So there are some design considerations that are really important for this approach that we'll be talking about. And then I'll walk you through the approach using an example from a 1-year project. So we'll get very concrete. Anyone who knows me knows I'm very practical, and I really want this to be useful and really illustrate it using an actual project where we actually did this, but we do this approach pretty much with all of my projects. So we've been figuring it out for many years now, almost 10 years now, that this has been in motion and evolving, I would say. I think because of how long we've been using it, this and the variety of projects that I've worked on it with, and also the number of times I've taught it and heard from people in the field, I have a lot of frequently asked questions. So we'll be going through those a little bit later. That will be more in the second hour, and we'll talk about the limitations. As with any method or approach, it's never going to be perfect. It's never going to do everything. So there are always limitations, and I'll talk about those. And we'll wrap up the session by reviewing criteria for, quote, good qualitative research and how rapid work kind of fits into those different criteria, pieces of literature that I think are really great to draw on when we figure out what we want to do with our qualitative methods. So what I'll do just from a process standpoint is I'm going to go through a fair amount and not pay attention to the chat. And if it's anything technical, Elena will answer that. If it's, if you all are exchanging with one another, that's great too. And then I'll pause and I'll check in on the chat and answer questions after I cover a little bit of ground. Because what I find is often folks have questions that are going to get answered throughout the course of the session. So I'm going to try to cover a bit, then we'll pause and look at questions, and then we'll do some more. So I'm not going to go back and forth with chat the entire time, because it would, kind of impede our progress. But again, if anything technical is happening, be sure to put it in the chat so Elena can address it. And yes, we're going to be sending out the PowerPoint after the session. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, I am an anthropologist and had wonderful training in anthropology. But I would say a lot of my methods training came a little bit later. And I do mostly health services research and implementation research. And both of those types of research call upon qualitative methods pretty extensively, which is very exciting for those of us who do this work. And one of the questions that I kept getting back in the early days when I was like one of the only qualitative people doing this work is, I love this, the qualitative work, but how can you do it more quickly? And how can you give me what I want to know more efficiently? And so that's really been my guiding question in this work for many years now is how can we do this work? Having come from an anthropological ethnographic background where we really weren't thinking about being quick, we weren't thinking about being super efficient. We were really thinking about hanging out for a very long time and being very sort of all-encompassing with our methods and our approaches and very, open-ended and inductive and exploratory. And I love all of that, but it wasn't always such a great fit with what we were doing in health services research and in implementation research. And so I started to really think, how can we do this work, still be rigorous, but be efficient and also be impactful and do the work so that we are getting utility from our research findings and also positioning ourselves so that the findings that we have can be translated into practice. I really like this paper by Chandler. I'm sorry if the slides might be a little cut off at the bottom because my screen is a little small, but you'll have all of this and all the references are at the bottom and there are various slides with references as well. But I agree with this statement that researchers should strive to demonstrate how the data are meaningful, appeal to various audiences, and engage stakeholders in the relevance of the research. And I think, the more that we turn to community-based research, the more that we try to make our impactful for a variety of stakeholders, it's really on us to figure out what do we do with our data, what do we do with our analyses so we can accomplish those goals. These are not the goals that everyone has with qualitative, and I fully acknowledge that. And you all can feel free to argue with me, poke at me, ask questions. I have a very thick skin, and I can, I won't necessarily agree with any arguments that with various arguments that you may have, but I'm definitely happy to entertain them because they only make the work better. And like I said, this is not a perfect approach. It's an approach that has really worked well for us and that has allowed us to answer this call to really figure out how to make qualitative work appeal to different stakeholders. So that's kind of the place where I'm coming from with this work, just to put it on the table for you all. So let's get into a couple of definitions. What do we mean by rapid? I am definitely not the only kid on the block who's been doing stuff related to rapid. There are many, many folks doing methods related work that speaks to a more rapid approach. Probably one of the more well-known works is James Beebe's work, Rapid Assessment Process, which was published back in 2001, and how he defines rapid is intensive team-based qualitative inquiry using triangulation, iterative data analysis, and additional data collection to quickly develop a preliminary understanding of a situation from the insider's perspective. And he defines rapid as a minimum of 4 days, a maximum of 6 weeks. A lot of this work was going on in public health, it still is, where you're kind of maybe going into the field in a very time-sensitive situation, rapidly collecting data for some particular phenomenon that's going on. There are some things about this definition that I really like. One, that it maintains this lens of qualitative inquiry. So just because we're doing things more rapidly doesn't mean that we are losing that spirit of inquiry. We still want to maintain the spirit of inquiry. We are also using this approach to develop that preliminary understanding. So there's a lot more that you're going to want to do with your data in addition to what we're going to be talking about today. And I'll get into that a little bit later. It's really just like, let's get a window in on what's going on. And then we probably are going to use other techniques to flesh that out more. So it's a starting place. It's not the entirety of what you would want to do. I tend to think about rapid projects as projects of a year or less. So I'm a little bit broader than that definition. And sometimes it's not so much that the project is a year, but that the phase in which you're using the rapid analysis is a year, maybe it's 6 months. So we know, like in implementation projects, for example, that there are different phases, and you might also think about each of those phases as a sort of rapid piece of the cycle of your work. But we don't mean rushed when we're talking about rapid. We still want to be rigorous. We still want to really pay attention to quality and pay attention to nuance and the detail that comes out of qualitative work. So why would we do rapid qualitative methods? Well, as I mentioned, I have heard a lot that qualitative methods are great, but they take too much time. And I took that as sort of a challenge to say, well, can we do it a little bit more quickly so that it is of value in a more timely way? And we have seen just a huge proliferation of opportunities for qualitative methods in various types of research, not only health services implementation, as I mentioned, but evaluation research and many other areas as well are really putting qualitative methods in a very prominent place, such that for many mechanisms, you're probably not even going to get funded if you don't have qualitative methods at this point. So that's very exciting. It means we have a lot of opportunities, and we really have to figure out how do we do this work in these constricted timeframes where we really have a high demand for products, different types of products, not just academic papers. And we still have that high expectation of rigor. So we still want to maintain our attention to all of the foundational principles of good qualitative research. And that's why we're going to end our day talking about that. So I've heard so many different reasons why people want to learn about a rapid approach, and I'm guessing you all can add very much to this list. Of course, it could be because your project has a very short turnaround. You have deliverables due on a certain date. You might be at a certain point in your career trajectory and you need to publish, you need to push work out. Maybe you're working on a proposal and you need to get some preliminary studies together, or you have some partners who are expecting some rapid feedback on qualitative work that you've done for them. It may be that you're using the qualitative data for other aspects of the project. So like I said before, you may have a phased data collection process and you need to know from one phase what to do in the next phase. So you can't take 2 years to figure that out. You've got to figure out, what did I learn in this phase that's going to inform my next steps? That may be because you're making an adjustment to the implementation strategy. Maybe you're making some adaptations to an intervention. It could be that you're using qualitative data to inform your quantitative measurement. So you could be analyzing your interviews in order to develop a survey, for example, or maybe to expand on results from a survey. And of course, qualitative methods are really well suited for time-sensitive issues, for when things don't go as expected in studies, unexpected discoveries or findings, and you're like, I don't quite know what happened there. Why is it that our findings were as they are? And can we use qualitative methods to help us understand that? And this is not an exhaustive list. These are many things that have come up in my work and in others' work. And like I said, I'm sure many of you have additional pressures that you could add to this list. There's some really interesting work being put out by Vendrola Padros and colleagues about rapid techniques. They did a critical review of the literature about 1.5 years ago, and what they found in their critical review was that there were 6 main reasons for taking a rapid approach. To reduce time, of course, always going to be number 1, to reduce cost, to increase the amount of collected data, to improve efficiency and accuracy, and to obtain a closer approximation to the narrated realities of research participants. So some overlap with those rationales that I was giving previously. Some really interesting paper if you want an overview of kind of where we're at with rapid techniques in qualitative research. I have found that in using rapid, it definitely does reduce time and cost, because whenever you reduce time, you're reducing cost of staff and so forth. Increasing the amount of collected data, I haven't necessarily found that, but it's definitely increasing our ability to work with large volumes of data. I feel like we do maintain really close attention to efficiency and accuracy, and we'll be talking about point number 6, which is very interesting. Okay, so what is unique about doing this type of work? I would say that rapid work tends to be more telescoped, so you're really focusing in on a set of phenomena that you need to understand in order to achieve your aims. It's pretty action-oriented, it's very applied. So there's this pragmatic need for the qualitative data. Maybe you need to describe where something is happening, the environment where an intervention is going to be in place, or where a policy is about to be implemented, or some type of educational practice. Maybe you need to describe the processes that are going on during implementation. Qualitative methods are really well suited for that. Maybe you want, like in implementation, we often want to know kind of where are we starting from? What is the usual array of services, practices, everyday experiences? Again, to kind of get at that question of what are we putting ourselves into when we're introducing something new. Maybe we're new to a setting or new to a team, and we kind of need that lay of the land before we start changing things. Qualitative methods, of course, are really well suited for that. This work, I highly, highly recommend doing it in teams. Can you do rapid work by yourself? Yes, and I've definitely had a lot of students who are in that situation of doing this work by themselves. It's just going to be more rapid if you have a team, and it's going to be more fun, and you will get a little bit more traction in terms of the rigor of your analysis down the road. You're probably in this type of work going to need to draw data from multiple sources, and we're more often than not in the context of mixed methods work. So we're going to be triangulating with quantitative data, and usually trying to achieve an integrated mixed methods approach, which is another really good fit for what I'm going to describe to you today. There are trade-offs in rapid work when you don't have much time. There is potentially less time to be critical, less time to reflect, less time to synthesize. It doesn't mean that you're going to stop doing those things, and it doesn't mean that you will never do those things, right? So that time for synthesis may come a little bit later. Maybe you can't do it in the month you have to turn around your results, but in a few months after you've made it past some of your deliverables, maybe you say, okay, now we're going to sit back and really think about what do we have, what did we learn, where are we going to go next? So the point is not to say let's abandon our critical thinking, let's abandon reflection and synthesis. It's to say, when can I do that? When do I have that opportunity? And I don't want to forget that's a big part of my analytic process as well. Okay, so we're going to talk about design, and then I'll take a little moment to check in on the chat and any questions that you may have. So we're going to go a little distance, and then we'll pause and do some Q&A. So when you're designing a rapid qualitative study or phases that involve rapid qualitative work, these are not questions that are unique to rapid, just thinking about rapid in light of each of these questions. So you do want to start with that fundamental question of why am I taking a rapid approach? Is this appropriate for my research question, for my specific aims? And sometimes it's not going to be, and I'll go into occasions and situations where I don't think it's a great fit. More often than not, rapid studies or studies that involve rapid cycles are driven by some type of framework. So, for example, in implementation research, we are organizing and designing our studies according to at least one framework. You really can't do the work without that. So that means you're already starting from a more deductive place, a place of having some constructs in mind, and those ideally will infuse the design of your qualitative work. I did a session which we can give you all access to on writing an implementation proposal, where we talk about this piece of things more specifically related to implementation research. You want to think about who you're going to get data from. So whereas in a longer, less rapid, more inductive, more exploratory study, you may be like, I don't know who I'm going to get data from. I'm going to get it from everyone who will talk to me. I'm going to take this super open approach and going to be, living somewhere, talking to people. It's going to be much more ethnographic. Maybe you'll have some aspects of your sample that are very specified and others aspects of it that are not. In this work, you're going to be more specific about that. It doesn't mean that you won't use techniques like snowball sampling and things like that, but you're at least going in with a fairly concrete sense of your sources of data. And of course, we have to have that when we propose this work anyway, right? In a proposal, you can't say, I don't know who I'm going to talk to, and I don't know how many people I'm going to talk to. That's not going to work for your reviewers, right? You have to have that rationale for your sampling frame. Of course, you need to have a sense of how many people you're going to talk to because it affects your budget. So you have to have that more concrete sense of what data you're going to collect from whom, and also the timing of data collection. So when are you going to collect the data? What is the logic behind that? What's the rationale? Are you collecting it pre, mid, and post? Are you collecting it monthly? Some people are doing daily data collection with things like ecological momentary assessment. So it's not to say any method like that is bad. It's just to say, what is the logic behind the timing of your data collection, and how does that feed into your timeline in this more rapid turnaround context? You want to think really carefully about who will analyze the data. Who will collect the data? What's the training of the team? What's the size of the team? What are the skills of the team? And how you're going to analyze it. So you don't want to think about this down the road and you haven't really collected the data in a way that would support your ability to analyze it according to a particular approach, and we'll get into this. You want to think about it early and set it up so that you're well situated to analyze it as you're moving along. And I'll get into where I think the rapid approach has worked really well for us in terms of expanding capacity and opportunities on the team. And you also want to think about where your results are going. So who are your audiences? What are they expecting from you? A lot of the work that we do, the expectation, sure, they're like, great, you want to write academic papers, that's fine. But there are other things that they're going to want. And so really thinking about what are we generating in terms of products, and are those well suited for our audiences? And might our decisions about design relate to our audiences? I would argue that they should. And you really want to think about, how do you want to tell stories? I still think that what qualitative data gives us is the ability to tell really rich stories. And I would never want to lose that, no matter what analytic approach I'm taking. And so you just want to think, what is this approach going to give me in terms of the ability to tell stories with my data? So I really think about this work as being bounded by time. Of course, we're fundamentally talking about a time issue, and we're talking about rapid. So we're really thinking about how time encompasses our methods decision making. So it really comes down to this combination of very specific and targeted questions or aims, plus a prepared team, plus a feasible data collection and analysis plan, plus specific and targeted products. So it's that collection of things that works really well for rapid turnaround projects. If you can hit all of these, and you like the things that I'm sharing with you today, you should be able to get a really good distance with your work. Okay, so in terms of choosing methods, this is a pretty important part of how rapid works and also how it doesn't exactly work. So if we think about qualitative methods on a spectrum, we have highly unstructured qualitative methods, and we have all the way to structured qualitative methods. So, and all of these are legitimate methods, important methods, suitable methods for different types of research questions. So there's no valuing of one set of methods over another. It's just saying, what is the right set of methods for the question that I have? What I would argue with rapid work is that it's going to work better when the methods that you're choosing fall in the semi-structured to structured side of the spectrum. So that's a very important point. What you'll see is that the rapid analysis approach is a structured approach, right? So you don't want to match a more structured approach to an unstructured set of data. It would not feel good. It would not be fun. I don't think it would do the data justice. So this approach that I'm going to be sharing with you is really much better suited for semi-structured data. That means that there's some elements of the data that are going to be consistent across data collection, as opposed to maybe going into the field, which I love to do, and doing like life history interviews where you're really having the person you're talking with narrate their lives and their experiences in whatever way they want with very minimal input from you. That's going to be highly unstructured. It's going to be super interesting, super rich, very exciting, not well suited for rapid. Okay, that you want to use other analytic techniques, phenomenological, I mean, you name it, grounded theory, great for that type of data collection. Many other paradigms that we have available to us for the more unstructured side of the spectrum, okay? So we'll be coming back to this point often, but it's very important to acknowledge that this is not an approach for every type of data. To that point, even in the qualitative methods that you choose, you may want to embed some more structured aspects to those methods. So, for example, if you're using focus groups as a method, you could have some structured activities involved in use of focus groups. So, for example, my colleagues and I, Kevin Heslin and colleagues and I did a project years ago about establishing quality standards for sober living homes, so where people go to live and recover from substance use. And at the time, there were really no standards for these homes, so people could start sober living homes, and they varied quite a bit in terms of their quality, safety, et cetera. So an advocacy group wanted to develop quality standards, and we set about to do focus groups with residents of sober living homes to help develop those standards. And we had all of the typical approaches to focus groups, you know, getting to know each other and asking some very open-ended questions. And then about halfway through, we asked each person in the group to take an index card and list the top 3 things they would want to see in terms of criteria for quality for the sober living home environment. And we took those lists, we collated them really quick during a break, and then we put them on these really big Post-its throughout the room on the walls. And we started to brainstorm with them and said, okay, you know, 5 of you said this was the number 1, and 6 of you said this was number 2, et cetera. And I think it even surprised us how well it worked, because it became more dynamic. So even though it was a structured activity, it became really dynamic where people were actually getting up from the table and like, oh, wait, you know, I forgot about that. That's really important to me. Can you move my number 2 over to my number 1? And can you, and people were around the room and writing on the Post-its. It was super fun. And also, most importantly, it was super productive. So not only did we have this rich qualitative data coming out of these focus groups, we also had a literal list of items that could be then translated into the quality standards that this advocacy group was looking for, to start building some policy around what are the minimum standards that these sober living homes should meet. We have several publications about this if you're interested. So activities can be great. They can add that structured element. You just have to be, I could talk all day about focus groups, but that's not what we're here for. You have to be really prepared for them. You have to be ready and organized and know what purpose you want them to serve, because they do take time. So you really want them to be a very intentional aspect of the work that you do with that method. Similarly, in semi-structured interviews, you could include like 1 or 2 rating or ranking questions. I wouldn't go overboard because then it stops feeling and being qualitative, but you might have a question like, we had a question in a study of suicide risk protocols in high schools. And we wanted to know, relative to other priorities in the high schools, how important was it to have this protocol? And so we said, you know, of all of the priorities that you have, on a scale from 1 to 10, how important is this? It was one of several questions, most of which were open-ended, but it gave us this little piece of structured data that was really nice for just moving our results forward and having that nice combination of semi-structured and structured data in the end. In observational work, you can use templates. So those are going to, again, kind of structure the way in which you're observing different phenomena. So many different approaches you can use to just build in a little bit more of that structured dimension of data collection. And that's going to work well for rapid. It's going to work well for mixed methods research. And you'll see this in the examples as well. I'm going to stop there because we're going to get a little bit into interview guides and the setup of interview guides and the example that I'm going to use today. So let me check in on the chat. Elena, I might not be able to do a good job of jumping through the whole thing because I see a lot, which is great. So I might, let me see if I can. All right, I see Ashley's question. I think most of the questions that have been coming up before have been technical, but correct me if I'm wrong, Elena. I see Ashley's question about sampling considerations for rapid is saturation assessed or approach. The sampling considerations, so saturation is something I thought might come up today, so we're going to get to that a little bit later. I think you always want to assess saturation, and I wouldn't say you would do it in a different way, but I do think there's a lot to unpack related to the idea of saturation. So if we have time, I will come back to that later, and I actually considered including some slides on saturation. This is why I don't send out slides in advance, because I always end up adding some. So because there's a question, I can add those in before we send them out to you all. That are just broadly about the issues of saturation with some references for you. Sampling considerations, what I would say in a nutshell about that is that you, in a more rapid turnaround context, you're probably not going to be able to talk to everyone who you would talk to if you weren't trying to do things rapidly. So you're going to be a little bit more targeted and specific, looking for those information-rich cases, making some decisions about which roles you're most interested in, which roles are going to be most aligned with your research questions and your aims. Is that a trade-off? Definitely. Might you want to talk to many, many more people? Probably, but you don't have time, right? That's just a reality. You just don't have time. So you really want to be thoughtful about who you are including in the sampling frame, because you're recognizing from the very beginning, you're probably not going to be able to, you know, be as expansive with your sample as you would be if you weren't in a more rapid turnaround context. So that's why that alignment with your research question, with your aim is so important, and thinking about your sample to say the people who I have to talk to be able to get answers to this research question are A, B, and C. It would also be nice to talk to D, E, and F groups, but I don't have time, or maybe if I have time later, I'll go back to that, whatever the case may be. You know, we can never be thoroughly exhaustive in what we do. And so to me, it's not so much trying to be exhaustive when we can't be, but rather being really clear about the decisions that we make, the rationales that we have, and justifying those and saying, this is going to have to be good enough for the time I have, for the resources I have, for the questions I have. Hello, Florence from Uganda. Welcome. I'm so glad that this is good timing for you. Love to hear more about what you're doing. In the rapid approach, is there an encouraged number of interviews to use? I would say no, because but we have to go back to that little diagram about time, because the more people you're including in your sample, the bigger team you need, right? You can't really think about sample size without thinking of the resources that you have. So we have some very large projects, like a sample size, because we have multiple sites, sample size of 160. And we use rapid analysis for that. But we have a large team who can handle the work that goes along with that. So it's like you have to think about that combination of factors. So you can have large projects, and in fact, one of the reasons why Rapid, I think, has worked so well for us is because it's helping us manage these projects with very, very large qualitative samples, relatively speaking, well over 100 interviews. And these are not quick interviews. These are long interviews. These are rich, deep, interesting interviews. So it's not that we're collecting this, super quick, 10-minute interviews. They're very long, not very long, but they're long, and they're intensive interviews. There's just a high volume because of the multiple sites, and we're really appreciating Rapid for very large scale qualitative studies. So I haven't really, I actually think it's well suited for projects that have large sample sizes. And of course, it works well for studies that have small sample sizes too. Hold on, let me make sure I'm scrolling. Are we able to receive a list of different ways to structure qualitative data collection? I can add some references about that, for sure. How large is our team? How many people? Let's see. I would say most teams, I mean, I'm very lucky. I'm very fortunate not only to have large teams, but to have large, amazing teams of very wonderful people, very skilled, talented social scientists. So some of our teams are like about 4 people. Some projects have been a little bit bigger. I would say we average about 4 to 6 people on large scale projects. I think that's accurate. About 4 to 6 people who are putting a pretty big chunks of time into these projects. Some are a little bit bigger, but that's about the average, 4 to 6, I would say. Yeah, sometimes 3. That's a great reference to the guest paper. Thank you for putting that in. Yes, I would definitely specify rapid analysis. And of course, I'm going to share one approach with you, but there are others out there. And I'm going to go over literature that cites the techniques that I'm sharing with you, and a lot of citations for that, and how people talk about it in papers. So we'll be getting to that later. Oh, and I think I made my way through all the questions. Okay, great questions so far. Thank you so much, everyone. Okay, so now we'll go a little bit further, and then I'll pause again for some more questions. So when we're thinking about interviews, the example that we're going to walk through the approach with today is based on semi-structured interviews. And I just wanted to make sure to cover a few key points about the use of semi-structured interviews in rapid turnaround research. So these are projects where we use a guide. Of course, there are qualitative projects where you're not even using a guide. I love those projects, but that's not what I do most of the time. So you're usually using a semi-structured interview guide. that is sometimes or often shaped by that conceptual framework that I talked about a little while ago. And you can consider using tables, and I'll show you an example of this, to align your interview questions with the constructs from your framework. So you can help, it really helps if you are using a framework to design your study, especially if it's mixed methods, it can really help to think about how are you operationalizing each of the constructs with your interview questions. Reviewers like to see that. It's really helpful for your mixed methods team because you want to think about, how am I addressing this construct in the qualitative work relative to how my colleague who's measuring this construct with some instrument, how are they dealing with it? So if you think about leadership, for example, I'm going to have probably a set of questions about leadership in my qualitative interviews, and I want to know, how does that connect to the way that leadership is being measured with the quantitative data collection, so that when it comes time to put this information together, we have that convergence of how we all looked at a particular construct. We're going to look at it with some different dimensions, of course, because we can do that using different methods. But the point is, I'm looking at leadership, the quantitative work is looking at leadership. So when it comes time to ask questions about leadership, we've got some really nice mixed methods data to do that with. So it can help if you're doing a more framework-oriented design to think about what do your questions look like in relation to those constructs. Now, again, designing interview guides, one of my most favorite topics. We can't get into it too much today. There's a lot more information that in a paper that Erin Finley and I wrote about qualitative methods and implementation research, which is cited at the bottom there. But in a nutshell, I would say that you want every interview question, every single question, to be inviting, accessible, and analyzable. You want it to hit all three of those. So you want it to be interesting for the folks that you're talking to. You want it to be something they can understand. You don't want them to say, well, what are you asking? I don't get the question that you're asking. Or maybe it has too many parts and they're like, what do you want me to answer first? And then you get some pretty inconsistent data. And you want it to be analyzable. So you want it to be useful for your project goals and answering your research questions. And we truly, no matter how much experience we have with designing interview guides, we truly think about these criteria every time we write a guide. Because sometimes we may have a question, it's great, it's inviting, it's interesting, it's accessible, but it's actually not going to do anything for the project. So that's not going to work. Right, so you want to think about that combination of inviting, accessible, and analyzable. And you want your guide to be geared toward the time that you have available. So if you have 30 minutes with someone, and that's maybe even generous considering the person's role, their availability, and so forth, there's just no way you're going to be able to ask 20 questions in an appropriate way. Right, so you want to think about how much time do I have? How many questions can I realistically ask in this period of time? And how do those questions, again, meet those goals of being inviting, accessible, and analyzable? So we typically are talking about like 6 to 8 primary questions in individual interviews, maybe 4 to 6 in focus group interviews, really thinking about the time you have, what are those key topics of inquiry, and can I get them asked consistently across the team in the time that we have? And I would also recommend prioritizing the questions. So you're sure to get those absolutely critical questions asked if time runs out or if the interview doesn't go as planned. So everyone on the team knows, if nothing else, be sure to ask questions 1 to 3. But that needs to be a conversation or perhaps multiple conversations. And of course, you want to test questions before going into the field. Okay, so the example that we're going to use today, it is an implementation example because our host today is the hub that I lead at UCLA that is about implementation science training. So we're using an implementation example. I have other examples and other versions of this, but today we'll use an implementation example. This was a study that Donna Washington, my colleague at the VA and UCLA, and I did a few years ago, we were really interested in homelessness among women veterans. And in particular, we were interested in developing a screening tool for homelessness vulnerability. It's a one-year project, a funding mechanism in VA that doesn't exist anymore, but at the time it was called a rapid response project, I think. I think that's what the R was. And the problem or the gap that we were addressing in this project was that we weren't detecting vulnerability to homelessness early enough in the pathway. And we had learned this through a lot of work that we had done that demonstrated that women's pathways to homelessness began a lot earlier, not a lot, but for some earlier in their lives than, a month ago. That pathway was launched through a variety of life experiences earlier. And so we wanted to close that gap by figuring out how can we identify vulnerability earlier, get women to services earlier, and also build a tool that's going to work in primary care and women's health settings. So we call it the V tool or vulnerability tool, which you'll see. So we designed the project with the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, or CFIR. And this was a pilot project in one healthcare system. So 1 year, one setting, basically using one framework that we designed our aims according to, with a planning aim, an engaging aim, an executing aim, and a reflecting and evaluating aim. So that's the CFIR. For those of you who are familiar with CFIR, that's the process domain and the components of that process domain. So we were using qualitative data to get at clinicians and women's knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs about screening for homelessness. We were making iterative adjustments to our tool, trying it out in aim 3, actually implementing it and getting some summary reports, revising it, and actually going through this cycle again. And you see here, our priority products were not academic papers, right? They were reports on implementation processes, responses to the intervention, and implementation strategies. So yes, of course, it's always great to write papers and do presentations, but our primary goal with this quick project was not those things. So this is just a visual of how we lined up our data sources and the purpose of those data sources. So you see the CFIR phases in the left column and the aims that corresponded to those, and the activities that we were doing for each aim, what types of data we had for each aim, and what the purpose of those data were. And we revised the tool after aim 4, and then we went back and repeated a whole cycle again, because we really wanted to get the information, analyze the data, make adjustments, and then make sure it was working, and then go through whatever steps to further refine it so that it would actually work in the system in real time. So this is just a piece of our interview guide, and I share this to go back to that point that I was making before about how a table might really help you think through the constructs that are available to you in your framework. So for example, focusing on the intervention characteristics domain of the CFIR, we were looking at things like usual practice, the strength of the evidence, the complexity of the tool, relative advantage of the tool, compatibility. These are all diffusion of innovation constructs as well. Most of them are. And so our questions were things like, how do you think this tool compares to other screeners? So you really want to get at, here's what we're going to do. How does this relate to the other things that you're going to do? How might it fit with how things flow in a patient appointment? So is it compatible with what you're doing? Now, I personally, as a reviewer, love seeing things like this in an appendix where you're seeing how these constructs are being operationalized in your qualitative data collection, but it can be a draft. This doesn't have to be perfect when you're just thinking it through. You want to do multiple iterations of your guides so that by the time you're in the field, they've really been thought through by a team who's paying attention to the ability of questions to not only answer your research question, but to speak to the different constructs that you have in your frameworks. So this is just a piece of it, and you'll see these questions come back a few times as we walk through the analytic approach. that's where we're going next. Let me see if there's anything I can deal with in the chat. Are there circumstances where I can use, thank you, Joy, where I can use rapid qualitative approach alone as my own research? Yes, a lot of people do. They only use rapid analysis. There are papers that have been published only using rapid analysis. I would say that, you really want to pay attention to expectations of your audiences and of the field that you're in. So there might be some who don't think it's sufficient or object to it for whatever reason. So just think about your audiences. And, there are lots of examples that I'm going to give you of folks who have published using this approach. I do think that it can get us a pretty good distance in a lot of the work that we do, and that you can publish on that and that you can rely on it as your approach. I would say more often than not, we do add in other analytic techniques in our projects, especially when we're writing more complex papers. But sometimes you don't have time. That's kind of the bottom line. Sometimes your audience does not necessitate more than what I'm going to share with you. So it's sort of a contextualized yes to that. Hi, Lynn. Can you discuss the intersection of rapid qual and other user-centered design interventions? Yes, I think I can get to that, Lynn. If you remind me, we can see if we have time later. But I think my, if I had to answer that in like a really rapid fashion, what I would say is that, this is an analytic technique that I think fits well with a lot of different intervention development approaches, because it helps you get through qualitative feedback about interventions in a rapid fashion so that you can engage in the steps of user-centered design, human-centered design, intervention mapping, all the various approaches that we might use to developing an intervention. So I think it's a good fit. I don't think I think it's using an analytic technique that supports that process of working on an intervention, or maybe refining or adapting an intervention. But we may come back to, we may be able to come back to that if we have time. After conducting rapid, does one always proceed to the usual analysis? I think that gets back to the earlier question, and I would say always is a strong word. So not always. I think you want to look at what you're trying to achieve and see, has the rapid approach gotten me to where I need to be? And do I need to bring in other analytic techniques? There will be many cases where you do need to, and some cases where you don't. Yes, Emily. You can engage community members in this process. That's one of the reasons why I really like it, is because you can engage lots of people in the process, which brings us right to where we are now. So thank you for that segue. I don't know if you provided it for me, but you did. That's one of the things about this approach that was really important to me back when I was working on it in the early days, which is how can we engage more people in data analysis? If we want to do this work rapidly, thank you for those questions. We're going to come back to more in a little bit. I'm going to plow through some content now because I want to get you through the approach, and then we'll move into questions. So I'm going to talk for a while. You can keep the questions rolling and resources, etc. And so I guess we're not taking a break. So if you need a break, feel free to take a break, but we only have an hour now, so let's keep going. So really one of the goals for me was to develop something that people could engage in that didn't require a PhD, didn't require a master's degree, didn't even necessarily require a, deep grounding in qualitative methods, because the more folks you have to help, the ostensibly the more quickly you can get through the work that needs to be done. So I thought, is there a way to engage more people in the process of looking at data, working on data? And it has a lot of really interesting ripple effects, I think, when we kind of expand what we think about in terms of the expertise that's needed, who can be involved in what, who can touch data. So of course, you want to follow all IRB parameters, so there's no skimping on any of that, but there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for engaging a wide variety of stakeholders in the work that we do with qualitative methods. And we'll see what you all think about that after I make my case to you. I really think of data analysis as a very multifaceted approach, and I want to have a lot of tools available to me. I don't want to feel like there's only one thing I can do with my data. I want to feel like there's a lot of things I can do. And if I'm moved to start working on a diagram, I'm going to work on a diagram. If I'm moved to write a memo, I'm going to write a memo. So I don't take the approach of saying, this particular analytic paradigm says I have to do A, and then I have to do B, and then I have to do C. And if I don't do that, I've messed something up, or I'm wrong, or I'm not a good analyst or something. That feels very constraining to me. So I'm definitely more of the mind that we need to use a lot of different tools to work with our data. This process that I'm going to share with you is a process of data consolidation or condensation. So that is at the heart of it, and there's no way around that. That's part of what we need to do to be able to turn preliminary analyses around quickly. This doesn't mean that you're not going to engage in other ways with your data. So some folks get nervous about this and they're like, it's reductionistic. We'll talk about that critique in a little bit, but it doesn't have to remain reductionistic, okay? There is a process where you're consolidating this very large data set that you may have, but it doesn't mean that you're never going to do other work with that. And some of your questions are really speaking to that already. So just to get to that point, there is a really interesting, hold on, I just need to move my thing a little bit. There's a really interesting shift that goes on in the work of Miles and Huberman, who have now passed, but who wrote, basically one of our very, very foundational books on analysis, qualitative data analysis source book. Back in the day, back in the 80s, when they were writing a lot about qualitative analysis, they talked about data reduction. And they say, that it occurs at all points in a study, from design through to data collection and write-up. It's not something separate from analysis. It is analysis of a form which sharpens, sorts, focuses, throws away, organizes, and clarifies data in such a way that final analysis can occur coherently. The reason I bring this up, many reasons I bring this up, but one of the things I hear a lot when I'm doing trainings is I've started coding the data, meaning I've started analyzing the data. And I do not think that coding is the equivalent of analysis. And you'll see that the approach I'm going to share with you is not about coding. So there's not coding involved. It can lead to coding, it can complement coding, it can still do coding, but it is not about coding. But I would argue that it is still data analysis. But what happened in the work of Miles and Huberman with the addition of Johnny Saldana, who added on as an editor of the most recent version of the source book, is they did away with this idea of reduction. So what they say in the more recent version is we stay away from reduction as a term because it implies that we're weakening or losing something in the process. So the shift has really been toward these concepts of consolidation and condensation and away from reduction. And it may seem semantic, but it's actually an important semantic shift where we're not really talking about losing anything or weakening anything, but pulling things together so that they're manageable, basically. So that's why you're not going to see the language of reduction in what I'm going to share with you, but there is sort of there's a history there in terms of how we think about what we do with data. So the analytic context for what I'm going to share with you is an approach that my colleagues and I have developed called sort and sift, think and shift. I don't want to get into it in too much detail because we don't have time. We teach entire courses on this, but the whole idea is that, or the basic idea of this approach, which is coming out, I'm very happy to say, coming out in a paper this summer where we've been really trying to get this out for so many years. My colleagues, Ray Mayetta, Paul Mihas, Kevin Swartout, Jeff Petruzzelli, and I have been working on this for over a decade. Not this paper, but this approach. We finally have it all laid out in a paper. And the idea is that we're engaged with our data in this back and forth process of diving into the data and stepping back from the data. So at times we're reading, we're reviewing, we're documenting what we're seeing in the data. We're really in the transcripts, for example. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. How do we make sense of this? How do we make meaning of this particular transcript or these two transcripts in front of me? And then at other times we are sitting back and we're saying, let me think about this, let me process, let me think about some bigger picture questions that I may have. And that this is an iterative action between diving in and stepping back. It's not like you dive in, you step back, and then you're done. You're going to dive in, you're going to step back, you're going to dive back in, you're going to step back. So they're very interdependent, they're very synergistic. And the approach that I'm going to share with you falls in the diving in set of tools for this work. And it falls specifically in this idea of quotation inventory and data inventory. So you're really going to develop an inventory of what you have available to you in the data. And there are other aspects of the diving in process, memoing, diagramming, other aspects that we can talk about if we have time. But bottom line is that with rapid analysis, we're trying to give ourselves a guide to what's in, let's say, the transcripts, if that's the data source that you're using. So you want this sort of quick overview of what is in each data collection episode. So just to recap where we are before I get you into the details, this approach is part of this sort and sift, think and shift method, one piece of it. It's recommended really for semi-structured data collection, not for unstructured methods. You can use any type of data. We found people use all kinds of qualitative data with this approach. You really do need some clear topics or domains of inquiry for your interview questions, and you'll see why in a moment. Those domains might be mapped to some type of framework or model or theory, if that's the type of work that you're doing. And you really need a consistent approach to data collection. I can't emphasize that enough. You need this if it's rapid or not, from my point of view, but when it comes to trying to make sense of data quickly, you want to make sure that most people have asked most questions in a similar way in terms of your interviewers. So if you have a haphazard data collection across your team, you're going to have haphazard data to analyze, and that's going to be very hard to work your way through quickly. It doesn't mean that you're taking away the art of interviewing, taking away people's style, ways of interviewing. That's all great. That's why, those of us who do this work love this work, because we can bring ourselves into it very explicitly. But it does mean that the team knows these are the questions that we're out there asking, and our goal is to have a coherent data set. That it covers the topics of interest and the topics of inquiry that map back to our research question, our specific aims. Okay, so it's really kind of taking that alignment throughout the entire process. So we really need, basically, we have a lot of data. And one of the things that people get overwhelmed with is a lot of data. And they're like, oh my gosh, I have all these transcripts. I don't know what to do. I don't know where to start. And so oftentimes what people do first is say, I'm going to start coding. Well, it can really get you in a mess, right? Because if you don't know what's in your data, you probably are going to make a lot of codes that are not going to be useful. And I've seen it many, many times where you're like, well, the first thing I'm supposed to do is just start coding because that's what you do for analysis. And then you end up with like 300 codes, 400 codes. You're like, okay, now I'm totally overwhelmed with all these codes and I have no idea what my data is about. So we, in the sort and sift, think and shift approach, want to really hone in on this question of what is in your data and how can the data guide your analytic decision making. So this is an approach that's about creating that inventory of data contents. So we're using the language of condensation from the latest version of the source book, which is about selecting, focusing, simplifying, abstracting, and or transforming the data. So it really falls in that area. You're moving to what we call an episode profile or a templated summary of each data collection episode. It might think of it as a sketch. Okay, so every single interview, let's say we're working with interviews for now, every single interview has a summary associated with it. So if you have, like, just to give you a sense of what you have in the end, you might have a 50-page transcript, but along with that, which is very valuable, the transcript, we'll get to whether you need transcripts or not later. But with every transcript, you have a maybe 2 to 3 page summary of what is in that transcript. Okay, it's not a highly interpreted version of what's in that transcript. It is a sketch of what's in that transcript. And the idea is really to enhance your accessibility to what's in that data. What happened? What did you learn? What did the person talk about in that interview? Okay, so you'll see this come to life as we walk it through. Now, I said before, anything that involves like steps, like you have to do A, B, and C. I try not to get bogged down with stuff like that. Nonetheless, I do want to help process through this approach with steps. These can totally be tailored to what makes sense for your team, your style, the goals of the project, etc. This is the process that we use. It works well. So I'm going to walk you through each of these steps, and there are going to be variations on this. So this is basically how do we get to the summaries and what do we do with them. So I'm going to take you through each of these. I just wanted all the steps available to you on one slide. So now we're going to go through each of the steps. Okay, so the first step in creating a summary. So this is a template that you're going to use for your project, right? For every data collection episode, interview, let's say, in your project, you're going to use this template to summarize the data. So what we did here was, you saw the 2 first columns of this table before. These are the constructs on the left, the interview guide questions, and now what we've added is what I usually call a domain. So this is sort of the topic that corresponds to the interview guide question in a few words. So I emphasize here that it should be a neutral domain name. And the reason for that is that when you start to add in qualities of the domain, like positive and negative, it prompts, in my experience, it prompts a different type of thinking that starts to feel a little bit less rapid. So when you have to start to think about, is this positive, but maybe it's a little negative, maybe it's a little mixed, maybe when you're having to do that type of thinking and judgment call, it can add another layer that I'm not trying to introduce into this process. If for your project and your team and your goals, it works to do more of a valence type of domain name, then that's okay. Like, that's not a bad thing. It's just a decision point that you want to make and that you want the team to be really clear about. So where we say, to the best of your knowledge, what types of mental health screeners are currently used routinely with women veterans? My basic topic there is the currently used screeners. So that's my equivalent, my domain equivalent. Are the current screeners effective? If yes, please describe them. If no, please describe why not. So effectiveness of current screeners. You'll see that for the questions about complexity and design quality, there are a few questions. And because this is at the heart of what we were trying to do with this tool, was figure out what it should look like, what it should contain, who should do it, and when it should be done, we actually developed 4 domains for this set of questions. Sometimes there's going to be a one-to-one correspondence. Sometimes there's going to be more than one domain per question. It really is about making the template useful for you. So there isn't like one way to do it. It's how am I going to access this information in the most efficient way. In this case, I really wanted the information about each of these domains, so I created separate domains for each of them instead of doing, sort of a more broad perceptions of the tool or something like that. That's not going to be specific enough for me. Now, typically for the domain, I don't use the construct names because they tend to be a little bit abstract. The constructs that we are given in different frameworks tend to be a little bit more abstract. In this case, I was doing the summaries. I'm very familiar with relative advantage. I know exactly what that refers to, so I use that as the domain name. There are other examples, which I will share with you later, of folks who are using constructs in their rapid analysis approach. So lots of variations on this that are super interesting and helpful, and those will be coming up later. And then there's fit with patient flow. So this is what a template looks like. I see questions coming in, which I will get to after I cover a little bit more ground. Looks very simple, right? You saw the domains here on the right, and they're just moved into a Word document, very simple. And then there's room for bullet points underneath each domain name. So you might want to have information at the top about who prepared it, maybe what site the interview took place at, what the role. You can put whatever information you want up there, whatever is going to be helpful to you to see at a glance, and still compliant with your IRB in terms of identifiers, et cetera. So you're just shifting the domains into a template. What we usually do is decide as a team what we think that draft set of domains is going to look like. So it might be one person who initially says, here's what I propose the domains to be, and then the team will review it. We might make some tweaks to it, or we might just wait until we try it out and then make some adjustments a little bit later. But throughout the process, if you're going to have a team work on this, you want the team to be involved in each step because they're going to be the ones using it. So everyone needs to have a shared understanding of what you're trying to do with it. You also, I would recommend strongly, I would encourage you to include two other pieces at the bottom of each template. One called something like other observations. It doesn't have to be that exactly, but there is going to be stuff that comes up in interviews that does not fit into the domains. That's what happens in interviews. That's one of the beauties of interviews, is that not everything goes into those nice, neat questions that we ask, and that is totally fine. And you want a place to document the material that doesn't fit into the domain. And then you also might want space at the end for important quotations. As you'll see, we don't include, in the way that we use this approach, we don't include really long quotations in the summaries because it's going to make them very long. However, there are those quotes that come up during the course of interviews where you're like, that is incredible, that's amazing. That person said something like so perfect. I know I'm going to put that in a paper or a presentation or report, whatever. That's the type of thing, if I were coding, I would code it as an important quotation. And you might want to take the step of pasting that into your summary. Now, there's a lot of variation on this. What I've observed is with people doing this process who are not as familiar with working with qualitative data, they may not be as confident about identifying important quotations. So I don't put it as like a required piece of this process, because some are going to be like, I know exactly what goes there. And then other people are going to be like, I don't know, maybe this is important, maybe it's not. Chances are it probably is if they think it is, but there's that confidence in doing this that takes a little time to develop. So if people want to put important quotations in, they do. And if they don't, they don't. That's okay. But we tend to include it because we do like to get those important quotations in the template itself. Once you have the template designed, you don't just want to go off and use it with 100 interviews. You want to make sure that it works. So you want to take it for what I call a test drive. So what we typically do is develop the template, and then everyone on the team who's going to be engaged in rapid analysis takes the same set of transcripts, maybe it's like 3 transcripts, and independently uses the template. And we see how it works, whether people are using it in the same way, and whatever adjustments need to be made to it. And we want to assess the template, make sure that it is functioning as you want it to. So a couple of the key questions that we ask are, can we find those domains? You should be able to if the interview guide was used as intended, right? Because if the domains are part of the interview questions and the questions were asked, pretty much as they were designed, then you should be able to find the domains. If you don't, then you might need to ask questions about data collection. There might be missing domains, fairly unusual for that to happen because, again, what you're relying on is very consistent data collection. Possible, I don't observe that to happen very much, but you do find that the domain you've put in the template isn't quite right. Maybe you need to change the name of it, maybe you need to expand on a little bit. So we're often changing the names of the domains, but it's rare that we'll find an entire topic is just missing from the template, because how could there be a whole topic coming up in the interviews, in multiple interviews, that is not reflected in the interview guide? That might, again, take you to a different direction with data collection. The template should be easy to use. That's kind of at the heart of this, is that it should be easy and it shouldn't take very long to complete it. So we have found, like, for a fairly consistently executed interview that's maybe 30 to 45 minutes, maybe it'll take you about an hour to complete the template. That's a ballpark. Might take less time, might take more time, especially if the interview didn't go according to the guide. That's another topic that we'll get into in a little bit. But for the most part, if the interview went as intended, it's going to take, roughly an hour to complete a template, maybe less, depending on how rich the data is. I'm ignoring chats, but I see things happening, but I will get to them in a little bit, I promise. You're still test driving here, okay, that we're not using it widely yet. You want to look at people's styles, because especially when people are doing this for the first time, they're going to have really different approaches to it. Or maybe it's not people's first time, but it's a different configuration of the team. So people haven't done it together in that team formation before. So you really want to look at how people do this. You want to look at whether people are picking up the same volume of information. So maybe under one domain, I have 2 bullet points, and maybe Erin has looked at the same transcript and she has 5 bullet points. So we want to say, maybe I should have had 5, maybe she should have had a few less. But it's not a right or wrong, it's a consensus-based process where you want to figure out how much volume do we want to have, how in the weeds are we getting with the volume. And that's something that I can't tell you, exactly how to do. It's something that you need to assess as a team and come to a consensus about in terms of how much volume of information you're capturing in each domain. You also want to look for quotation segments. So we do a lot of paraphrasing or like snippets of quotations, because as you'll see, we're going to refer to the line numbers where that quotation can be found. So it's not like you're losing the quotation, you're giving yourself basically a table of contents to the quotation. When you're using very long quotation segments, the summaries are going to get longer and then they're going to be less efficient to read. So you may say, I don't care, I don't mind if they're longer, we're going to include more quotation segments, that's totally fine. I do these in Word, sometimes people do them in Excel. They put more quotations in using Excel. Lots of variations possible here. A couple of other points, you want to comment on the absence of content. So you have a domain, it's quite possible that the question wasn't asked. So you don't want to have an empty domain, because it's going to be hard to understand that later when we look at matrices. You want to give yourself a clue as to why there isn't any content there. So I would recommend noting that the question wasn't asked, or maybe you asked the question, but the person didn't answer it. So just note that down. It wasn't asked, or it was asked but not answered. On the other hand, you may want to note when there's a lot of depth on a particular domain. So you might want to say, this is that interview where the person talked for 15 minutes about this, or there are amazing quotes in this transcript. You can add line numbers. So this is all giving you, again, that access back to what's in the transcript. So anyone looking at this would say, oh, cool, this is that interview where they talked about this in this really interesting way. That's on line 140 to 175. Go straight to the transcript. There's the quotations. I can read it right there. So it's just giving you that referencing ability to get back to the transcript. You may need to go through that cycle of testing the template more than once if there's a lot of variation the first time people do it. I have typically found we don't need to do it more than twice. But if you have to do it 3 times, that's okay too. I would do the same process a couple times just to make sure the template is working. And after it's been established, then you can start dividing up the transcripts across the team and summarize. And you can make all kinds of decisions about how you do that. So you may say, you know, I'm going to handle the primary care providers and Karen's going to handle the nurses, or I'm going to handle the LA interviews and Tammy's going to handle the New York interviews, or whatever it is. You can make all kinds of strategic decisions like that. You can say, I'm going to summarize all the interviews that I conducted because I'm ostensibly the most familiar with them, etc. So this is just a tiny piece of transcript summary that's starting to be filled out. And you see I have a few little pieces of quotes. So currently used screeners quote just the one we have to use about whether they'll be homeless in 30 days. Effectiveness of current screeners has identified, quote, a few patients who are at risk of being homeless. Response to the format, it's good because it's short. So the person might have said, you know, a whole paragraph worth of information about how it's good because it's short, but the essence of that is it's good because it's short. So I'm going to try to get that essence into my transcript summary. So what makes for a good summary? I promise I'm going to get to questions in maybe about 5 minutes. What makes for a good, this time goes really, really fast. What makes for a good summary? They are brief. That is the whole idea, right? Is that they're brief. We really, really, really try to keep them to 2 pages. If we're including some important quotations, maybe they extend to 3. So again, we're taking a 40, 50, 60 page transcript and kind of boiling it down, condensing it, to use that language of Miles Humerman and Saldana. We're condensing it into about 2 to 3 pages of an inventory of what's in that long transcript. We're not doing anything to the data. We're basically giving ourselves this overview of what's in the data. It's organized. That's very important. It's thorough still. So all the major points that were made in the interview are captured in the summary. One of the best ways for me to figure out if a summary is helpful is I should be able to read it and get a sense of what the respondents said. That's really helpful. Like if you're not doing all the interviews, but you want to have a sense of what people talked about, yes, ideally you would read all the transcripts. That is the best. That is like absolutely the best thing you could possibly do. We just often don't have time to do that in the parameters that we have. And so at the very least, I'm going to be able to read a summary and say, okay, I get basically what this person said. I don't get all the nuances. I don't get all the details. For that, I really need to read the transcript, but I get the basic dimensions of what this person said, and that's really what the goal of the summaries are. And they should be very useful. They should provide pointers for what's in the transcript. So okay, we've let's say we've summarized 50 interviews, let's say. So all 50 transcripts have these summaries associated with them. And you can do a lot just with the summaries. What these are, we want to think about the summaries as vertical accounts of each transcript. And as you can tell from how I talk about this, I'm very transcript oriented. And I know not everyone can have transcripts, so we're going to get to that in a little bit. But I myself am spoiled with transcripts. I love transcripts. I need transcripts. I find it hard to work without them. But people do it very effectively. And there are some great references about this. So if you're in that situation, that's coming. So basically, I have this inventory of what is in each transcript available to me. And that alone gives me tons to work with. I can work on memos related to that. I can start thinking about, you know, how I might construct my code book if I'm going to do some coding. There's a lot of work I can do with my summaries. What we more often than not do is move the summary information into matrices, into tables. So this is the last step, so to speak. This is where we go next. In terms of the rapid analysis process, is set up matrices in any number of strategic ways that make sense for the analysis. There's a great paper by Averill about matrix analysis where she says that the matrices really give us this ability to note similarities, differences, and trends across groups of informants, and they make findings accessible to folks who aren't going to look at our transcripts. That's a lot of the people I work with. They're like, that's great, you do what you do, tell me what you found, that's all I need to know. They're not going to read the transcripts. That's not their job. That's not what they were trained to do. So there's lots of reasons why matrices, which have been talked about in many different books and articles about data analysis. I did not come up with matrix analysis by any stretch of the imagination. It happens to work well with this rapid analysis approach, but it's a very common technique for kind of getting this view of what you have in your data more horizontally. So you're starting to look at the horizontal. If it still makes you nervous that displays are something I just came up with, that really they're not. Miles and Huberman and Saldana talk about data displays as a way to assemble information in an organized way in an immediately accessible, compact form so you can see what's happening. And again, this is part of analysis. So to really kind of move away from this idea that if I'm not coding, I'm not analyzing, there's so many other things you can do besides coding that is part of analysis, in my point of view. You can set up the matrix in any number of formats that make sense for you for your analysis. You can do site level matrices, roles, waves of data collection. If you have large data sets, these can get pretty big. And so you really want to think about how can I make spin-offs of the matrices so that they're manageable. Maybe you're not going to include all of the domains. Maybe you're only going to do it by certain subsets of your sample, because otherwise they get really large and unwieldy. This is just an example. I'm going to go like 2 more slides and then I'll take questions. This is just an example of a matrix that we developed from the summaries that you saw. So now there are 3 summaries here. All I did was literally copy and paste the bullet points from the summary into a table. There's nothing else that's happened here. So this part is super easy. Anyone can do it. It does not involve any thought. You're just pasting the bullet points into a table. Some have asked, well, why wouldn't you just summarize straight into a table? You can do that. My preference is to have 1 summary per transcript and the matrices, because sometimes I only want to think about that 1 interview. I don't want my mind to go to a comparative place, which is what I think the matrix kind of prompts us to do, is start thinking about comparisons. Comparisons are super important, but sometimes I want to just think about that 1. Or maybe I'm going to interview someone who I interviewed a year ago. I don't want to look at the table and kind of dig through all of this. I want to go to my summary, remind myself of what they said a year ago, go to the interview and say, you know, a year ago you shared with me that you thought this would be a challenge for implementation. How's that been going? So you're really using it as a resource. That's my preference, but there are people who do the summaries straight into matrices, and that's up to you. So you see, I've got the bullet points, and now I can start to look down and think, okay, across my interviews, what am I learning? So even if we just look at the final column, the response to the vTool format, you saw that 1 snippet before. Good because it's short. Interview 2 says, I like that it's short. I'm worried about the answers. Who will ask the patients? Do I do this and the other one? The 3rd person says, at least it's not long. What will we do if they say yes? So we're already starting to see in these tiny little bullet points, they like that it's short and it's not long. That is super clear. Got that loud and clear. Next set of questions. What do we do when they say, yes, I am actually, you know, in what we would interpret as vulnerable to homelessness? What is the screener then going to do? So then we had to work on the algorithm of the screener, you know, who's going to do it. We had to ask questions about that. How is it going to fit with other screeners that exist? So we took just the response information and made modifications, and it allowed us to do that really efficiently because the essence of that information was available to us in the matrix. So with the matrices, wow, they can do so much for you, and there's so many great papers that use matrices. There are so many things you can do with them. You can, of course, you can look at the content of any given domain. You're looking at the variation in that content. You can assess gaps in information. So are there gaps because a question was consistently not being asked? Maybe the question didn't work well, so you're looking at some quality issues. You can work with your matrices and develop memos about different topics, about the overall project. You can develop summaries of the summaries, which we often do, like we might build a site level summary out of a site matrix where we're starting to say, here's all the things that are going on. Like maybe we were assessing usual care before implementation. And we say, here are the things they're engaged in, here are their concerns, here are the barriers that they raised, here are the things that might help implementation. So there's all this information that you're getting from just what's in the data. So I think I probably haven't said enough that a lot of this process is meant to be minimally interpretive, okay? This is where some folks get hung up in terms of their approach to analysis because we're often trained to be extremely interpretive, even in our first pass through the data. And we would argue in the sort and sift approach that you really need to know the data, you need to know what's in the data, you need to see where the data takes you. And as you develop that deep understanding of the data, which the summaries really help you with, then you can start moving toward interpretation. We don't want to be too interpretive too quickly when we don't even really know what's in the data. People will argue with me about that. I have been argued with about that. That is my way of thinking about it. Okay, so it's hard to believe we only have 20 minutes left, but I'm going to pause there. Let me go back here, pause there, and see what you've got going on and questions. Thank you for the time marker, Elena. Hopefully I'm going to address some of these. How do you sort through the matrix when there are hundreds of respondents? Yes, Ashley. That's where I think you really need to be strategic about how you're setting them up. And like, maybe you have hundreds of respondents, but they, from your sampling frame, they represent different dimensions of your sampling frame. So you want to do one matrix per characteristic, let's say. So again, different roles, like one for your PCPs and one for your nurses and one for your clerks or something like that. So I don't love big, gigantic, huge matrices because I do find them overwhelming. So we try to break them down into more manageable pieces. Could one do rapid analysis with the code reports, then go through them to come up with key themes? Super interesting question. That's a really interesting question. I would think, so if I'm understanding correctly, Emily, like what I'm imagining are code reports like that would be generated from software, like output of a given code. I think you actually could, because if you're doing topically oriented coding, which is what I typically recommend, then your output would, if it's just about one code, would potentially be everything that people said about that topic. And then you could do some summarizing of that topic. So I could see how that could work. I might need to think about it a little bit, but if I'm understanding correctly, I could see how that might be useful. And sometimes that's what we are doing, is kind of summarizing that particular topic and then thinking about how it relates to other topics in the data. So my first reaction to that is there could be some interesting variations on what I've described that might make that really useful. But I will keep thinking about that. I really like that question. I like all the questions. Okay, we did Ashley's question about hundreds of respondents. Can the same piece of text fit into multiple domains? Really, really good question. Yes. That is definitely possible. What we tend to do is only locate text in the domain that it pertains to the most. And then in another domain where it might have also come up, we will put the note, see such and such domain for more information about this. So you can do that cross-referencing in the summaries. So you don't want to have a lot of duplication, because, or at least in the way I do it, you want to have a lot of duplication because they're going to get longer if you duplicate information, but you do want to give yourself the reference to where that information is. And it's quite possible that someone answered question 1 in response to question 3, right? So you want to locate their response that they gave to question 3 actually under the domain for 1, because it really is more relevant to what you were asking in number 1, but you want to put a note in any other relevant domain saying the person talked about this in relation to the other domain. So give yourself those guideposts for where the information is. There's no reason why you can't give yourself those tips and those cross-referencing notes in the context of the summaries. Do you have any recommendations for how to ensure the domains are on the same level as each other, or are sort of exhaustive, or is the creation of exhausting categories exhaustive? I probably interpreted that exhaustive categories potentially limiting. I wouldn't be super exhaustive because as you saw with the example, for the most part, there's going to be one domain per question. So if you have 10 questions, maybe you're going to have 10 or 12 domains. I wouldn't say you want to find yourself in a situation where you have 10 questions and you have 40 domains, because that's going to, then you probably want to use a different analytic technique. I would keep them pretty broad and topically oriented to sort of the main essence of the interview guide question. So only exhaustive in the sense that you've got at least one domain per interview guide question, but not so in the weeds that, then you start to be overwhelmed by 30 or 40 domains, because that's starting to move into a different territory. So I think that might be limiting in that it would stop being rapid and start feeling like something else. Thank you for the kind comment. Should we place outlier section per domain? Currently used screeners, outliers. Really good question. What I would probably do in that case, if something was a little different than what I expected, now there are varying schools of thought about this in teaching this over the years. Some people really like to make comments as they're making their way through developing the summaries. And I personally don't. I find it to be a different sort of cognitive task. So when I'm summarizing, I'm basically like, I need to get the information about this transcript into this summary. I'm not really thinking about it. I'm not totally not thinking about it, but I'm not really processing and interpreting it through. I'm not thinking about what's an outlier, what's not. I'm really trying to be very faithful to what did the person say. Now, if you want to get into, hey, this is really different than what other people have said, and you want to start maybe to develop a memo about that or write some comments about that, and it works for your style of working through this, then I think that's okay to do. And I've had many folks tell me that that's what they do. But you bring up the more novice researchers. I don't like to set that up as an expectation, because not everyone feels comfortable doing that. So if I have like super experienced people on the team and they're like, I'm going to write some memos while I do this because I'm having some really cool thoughts and I want to get them down. So I'm writing some memos, I'm making some comments as I'm doing the summaries. That's great. But for my teams, I don't set that up as an expectation, because not everyone feels as comfortable with that, if that makes sense. So I would just get the information down, and later you can look at, oh, this is really different. And the matrix might really help you pick up on when what someone says is sort of off the norm of what most people are saying, that what we might think of as an outlier. My issue is how to come up with appropriate domains constructs from the coding. So the domains are coming from your interview guide questions, not from the coding. So this whole process we engage in this process, and we've done no coding. Okay, so the domains are coming from your questions, which probably, if you're using a framework-oriented design, are mapping back to constructs from the framework. But the coding piece is a different piece of this. The rapid analysis can very much inform your coding, the setup of your codes, how you approach coding. That's going to come up in a minute. But the domains are, in this process, the way I've described it, the domains are coming from your interview questions. Is any formula regarding establishing consistency? No, we're not in this process doing any inter-reader agreement. It's a really good question. Once we've established the consistency of the template, we don't have two people do them. That's just usually kind of overkill, to be honest, with what we're trying to achieve with this approach. If we're moving into coding, then we do usually have a setup where we have a primary and a secondary coder for every interview. And we might do more work. We will do more work on consensus-based coding in that process. But here with this process, because you're not being highly interpretive, you're really trying to maintain that minimally interpretive orientation to the work. Once you make sure that the team is comfortable with the template and using it consistently across the team, then we just basically divide up the work, and that's for efficiency. Could we do more? Might you decide to do more on your team? Totally, you can do that. We don't tend to do it. We don't have the labor to get into that level of work with the summaries, but we will do more with that if we're moving into coding. Yes, the approach is useful for focus groups, and I have an example of that coming up. I love the term you use, but lost a second word. Yes, vertical inventory, yes. Focus groups, yes, getting to that. Florence, yes, we are doing summaries for large data sets. My thoughts on using qualitative software are that software like Atlas can be incredibly helpful with large data sets, and we more often than not do rely on it, especially when moving to coding. The reason why this particular process is not software related is that I want more people on the team to be able to engage in this than the people who have training in software. So we can do a lot of work with the data without, half the members of the team even knowing what Atlas is. So I do have team members who are very adept at Atlas and other software packages, and we will use that at some point. But for this process, it really doesn't rely on more advanced qualitative software packages, because we want a lot of people with a lot of different backgrounds, including community stakeholders, which I have not mentioned. But we've really successfully used this in more community-based participatory research as well, which has been so fun, so interesting, so insightful. I really, really recommend it. Love the emphasis on knowing the data before the interpretive path. I thank you so much for that comment. How do you do this process when you need to translate and transcribe? Yes, I'm going to comment on doing it without transcripts. Co-reports, how many domains are manageable? I would say, if your interview guide is 8 to 10 questions, 6 to 8 questions, maybe you have a handful more domains like we did for the homelessness vulnerability tool. Because we wanted to get a little bit more into the details of their response to the tool itself. So I broke that down a little bit more than I would have had that not been one of my goals. And you guys are responding to each other, which is gorgeous. You speak a bit about segmentation. Probably, I love that question. I just am not sure I can get into it, because what I think I need to do now, yes, and I can answer questions afterwards too and send out responses to the group. What I think I should do now, because this goes so fast, is going to walk you through what is available to you. Now I wish we had another hour. but we don't. So I'm going to walk you through what's available to you in the rest of the slides. And then if there are questions that come up, you can send them to us. And I'll do my best to prepare responses. So I think we covered that. So with, thank you so much for that feedback. So what you can do with your rapid analysis, a lot. You can, divide up the labor. You can assess the quality of data collection. The real heart of this is to obtain this quick, accessible understanding of what's in the data. You can use summaries to inform subsequent ways of data collection. These two items are in red because that refers to how we use this approach in the context of implementation research, where we need to turn those results around quickly for the next phase of data collection. And we may analytically want to move back to our framework or do some moving back and forth between our framework where we started and the data that we've been collecting. You can definitely prepare reports and presentations, and you can develop a coding approach. We talk about coding in terms of topic monitoring, but what you get with those matrices is a really good sense of the depth and breadth of information that you have in each domain, and that can then tell you, okay, I need a couple of codes for this. So that's a whole other topic, which I'm wondering if you may want to cover that in an upcoming seminar. So we're going to ask you that in a few minutes. So what you have, just to run you through, because there is one poll question that I want to ask before we wrap up. What you have in the remainder of the slides are frequently asked questions. There is an example of summarizing a focus group and a paper where we describe this process. So that's all laid out here. You can see in essence what we use. What we have found a little bit more helpful with summarizing focus groups is actually including the focus group questions that were asked and then giving the range of responses across the group, and definitely using those line numbers to know where to go in the transcripts. That's a very quick overview of what we do, but it is, you've got an example here and a paper where this is described. There was a paper that I didn't know was happening that compared the approach I just shared with you to thematic analysis, and it stood up pretty well. So if you want to see more about, well, how does this work in relation to thematic analysis, this team took it upon themselves to dig into that, and they found a high level of consistency between what was found in the thematic analysis and what was found in the rapid analysis. Here are a couple of papers that published from rapid analysis. These are all papers that cite the approach I just shared with you that was originally shared in a 2013 cyber seminar, which I referenced in the last slide. Here I get into some of the limitations of this approach. And there's a lot I could say about this, but I'll just let you know that it's here and there are alternatives. And then there are really good overviews of what is good qualitative work, the work of Sarah Tracy, the work of Deb Cohen and Ben Crabtree. And I would say that our rapid work can definitely meet these criteria, so we don't want to lose these criteria. There's a little bit about rigor. I'll add in the slides about saturation. Elena, please remind me. And let's close with one more poll question, just so we know where you want to go next. So if you can hang out and also fill in our evaluation, if you would be so kind, it will really help us with future sessions. But first, let's do this poll real quick. These are just some that I've been thinking about teaching, so that it's sort of just the kinds of things that I would like to do. So we wanted to get some sense of what you'd like to prioritize. I think I have my work cut out for me. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so we'll do some work on, we'll probably do a part 2 to this, and we can get much more into writing and publishing using this approach. And it looks like other analytic approaches is popular, rigor is a popular topic. These are all kind of popular topics, so that's great. Thank you so much. Elena's going to put the link to the evaluation in the chat. If you could really quickly do it for us, we would be so super grateful to have a good turnout for the evaluation. And it's really quick, I promise. And if you want to do it later, she's also going to send it to you in an email. And here are some more references for you that use some type of rapid approach or that I referenced throughout the presentation. I want to acknowledge a lot of funding sources that have really been impactful on the development of this. And thank you all so much for being here. I'm sorry it was so quick. There's a lot more to say, but hopefully we got through the biggest parts of it, and hopefully we'll see you again at a future workshop. So thank you all so much. Have a great weekend, a great rest of your day, and stay tuned for future workshops. Thank you, everyone.